Hello and welcome to the Orkhammer channel. Today we'll be talking about Warcry, the new skirmish combat game set in the Age of Sigmar universe. In this video we'll be discussing the best and worst fighters across a number of categories, but before that we'll also be talking about some game-wide stats. Now I've done a series of videos up to this point where I go through each warband and talk about the best value buys based on the number of points and how much damage they do and how durable they are on the tabletop. And I've made a few assumptions about the stats of the game as a whole because I didn't have a chance to look at all the data yet. Well, now I have all the data entered and I have the ability to do some analysis across all of that data. And so I'm going to present that data at the beginning so we can better understand the values as we see them for the best and worst fighters. So from this point forward, all the faction videos I'm going to release are going to have the updated formulas that take into account the real-world metrics of what's represented in the game. So updated formulas, more accurate data, all good things. So let's get into the data. So the game-wide stats, starting out with the distribution of toughness values. So in my original formulas, I had kind of roughly guessed that strength or toughness 3, 4, and 5 were somewhat evenly distributed. I think this is because I probably looked at the destruction faction first, which had a lot more toughness than other factions. So it turns out toughness 5 is a little bit rare. So toughness 4 is by far the most common. Toughness 3 is about half that, and toughness 5 is about a third as common as toughness 4. And there is a notable exception there with the toughness 2. But as I'm going to probably mention a few times in this video, I think toughness is probably overvalued. Actually, I know for a fact it's overvalued in Games Workshop's pointing algorithm for how they pointed these fighters. There's a few examples where there's a clear case for this being an overvalued metric. So I think the data is going to show that whatever you have situations where there's fighters with very low toughness and very low strength, those are probably going to end up being worth more than Games Workshop has pointed them. So I think a lot of our good buys are going to be in low toughness and low strength models. And I just don't think these attributes translate into the game as effective in the exact way that they had envisioned. So my formulas are going to assume when I'm talking about average damage done against all the enemies in the game, like from a specific model, I'm going to take into account the ratio that you see here on the screen. So how good, if I'm talking about a strength 3 fighter, how much damage he's outputting is going to be assuming he's fighting an average of this distribution of toughness models. So he's going to fare a little worse than in the previous stats. Okay, moving on. The wounds, so how many wounds a fighter has. This is where we see the data is looking a little funny. The average number of wounds comes out to 16.77, and I was hoping this would look a bit more like a bell curve. It does resemble a bell curve, but if the bell is really stretched and pulled on one side. So the bell skews heavily toward the right and toward the extreme. So there's some very high wound models, but most things seem to be kind of clustered around the average. But when they go below the average of 16.77, they don't go too far below. Because, 0 isn't too far in comparison to 40. So if you divide that number by the points of those models, then we get an average points per wound of 8.63. And this looks a lot more reasonable, a lot more like a bell curve. And I think it's going to make a bit more sense statistically. And as you can see off on the far right, there's a couple outliers, things that are extremely expensive for the points paid for them. But most things are kind of clustered nicely into distinct groups. Okay. Average attacks to kill. So I've reworked my metrics a little bit. I think, I can't remember what I was calling this before, average wounds or average damage or something like that. So this is basically how tough a model is. Instead of a metric of maximum compared to the maximum damage output of a model, this is just compared to the number of average attacks from an average fighter in the game to take down this unit. So I can say that because now with all the data in, I know what the average strength. Oh, I know what the average damage and the average critical damage values are. So we can say that per average attack, across the different levels of strength. So we know the distribution of strength values, and we know the average of damage and criticals. So then we can fuse those together and say how many attacks on average across the different strength values are going to be required to kill this fighter. So for each fighter, they're going to have a value. And across the entire game, they break down to what you see, with 15 being pretty standard. But a nice distribution across, with only a few really high outliers. Points per average attack to kill. So this is that previous metric divided by the number of points, and we get a nice bell curve with a couple really strong, very expensive options on the right that kind of break them all a little bit. But the average seems to be right around 10, which kind of, it's so close to 10 that it makes me think that I'm actually narrowing in on Games Workshop's actual pointing algorithm to some degree, because it's so suspiciously close to 10, the number that I've landed on here. Okay, so the distribution of strength values, there's one model with strength 2, there's 2 models with a strength 6 attack, and we have a whole bunch of 3s and 4s. So 3s and 4s make up the bulk of the game, and the strength 5 attacks are a little bit rare. Now the data I'm going on is from all of the attack profiles of all the fighters. So this may differ from the reality of the table. So for example, like you might have a warband that has one fighter entry, one profile for a chaff unit, and that has a low strength, but in effect, that there might be a warbands might take 5 of those, whereas they only take one leader that has the strength 5 attack. So each of those are one profile, but one of those is clearly more represented in the actual game. So I don't have data about the frequency of the units used in the game, and I don't know if I'm going to get that data anytime soon. So all we have to work with is what are in the attack profile. So across all the attack profiles, this is how the strengths break down. And this is quite a bit different than my assumptions at the beginning, where I was assuming that 2, 3, and 4, or 3, 4, and 5 were evenly distributed. It's clearly not the case. So I've adjusted all my formulas, and we'll have more accurate data going forward. Moving on, the base damage output. So this is the damage characteristic from the fighter card. It's pretty even split between 1 and 2. There's a few models, though, with a base damage 3, and a few elite models with base damage 4. And this gives us an average of 1.59. So 1.59 average damage across the entire game. So whenever I talk about average attacks to kill a model, I'm assuming that if the enemy does a damage, if they score a damage, it's doing 1.5 damage on average. So moving on. Average critical. This was an interesting curve. I was kind of surprised it worked out this way. So it's kind of like it's giving the big middle finger. 4 is by far the most common critical, which is pretty nice. And there's a few things that have extreme criticals of 10 and 8. So this works out a lot more. I thought that the graph would skew more towards like the 3s and the 2s, but to my surprise, those critical 4s really add up. And such a high critical is, I think, an important factor into why I believe the toughness and strength characteristics are overvalued, because the way the math works out, criticals end up doing the majority of damage at all times, and criticals are unaffected by toughness and strength. So those toughness and strength values, they're really just fighting over the table scraps from the critical damage output. So moving on. I will probably do a separate video about why toughness and strength aren't that great, but for now, just trust me, they don't work out that great. All right, the average damage output, this is per activation of all the fighters. So this is taking their critical damage output, their base damage output, taking into account the strength of their attacks and taking into account their strength versus the distribution of the different toughness values there are in the game. So how their strength matches up, and all of those things are weighted appropriately based on the numbers we see in the game. How much damage a particular fighter does in an activation on average, and it comes out to 4, and that's pretty much right in line with what I was seeing from my limited experience with the deep dives into the warbands. So 4 seems to be about the midpoint for like line infantry. Things under that are either ranged usually, or chaff type infantry, or even like 2 or 3 inch weapon type infantry is lower than that. And things that are significantly above this get into the semi-elite and elite territory. So 4 is the point at which it all turns. And you can see that there are some kind of breaks in there, and the area around 5.5 where we see that spike, that's seems to be a common point value for like semi-elites, and then the range from 6 to 7-ish is the elite territory, and a lot of those bosses are in that 6 to 8 range. So moving on, points per average damage. So you take those values, divide them by the points, and come to an average of 37.69. And this conforms a bit to the bell curve, so it'll make our stats nice. And one thing I've done in the coloring of my previous videos, I was kind of just going by my gut feeling of where the cutoff values should be for, making a cell green for good or red for bad and expensive. But now, since I have all these bell curves to fit things to, and I can calculate their mean and their standard deviation, now I've actually categorized the cell colorings based on where that number fits in terms of the bell curve to all the fighters in the game. So a bit more science behind my graphs and or behind my spreadsheets now. So moving on, I think probably why you tuned into the video. What are the best and worst fighters in the game across a number of categories? So let's get into it. The best value for durability. So this is overall how much attacks from all the different strengths it's going to take to kill. And I'm giving this one for the boss, the Savage Orc Arrow Boy boss, because he is the cheapest of those Bone Splitter's boss options, and he is, I believe, the same amount of wounds and durability. So his points for durability come out to be extremely good at 5.58 points per average attack to kill. And the best non-leader is the shield and spear version of the Bone Splitter troop at a nice kind of low line infantry value of 85 points. He is not quite as efficient point-wise as the boss, but you can only bring one boss. But if you needed to bulk out your warband with a bit more durability on the tabletop, there's nobody better. Unfortunately, he doesn't really do much damage at all. So you really are making a trade-off between the ability to dispatch enemies and the ability to not be dispatched with this warband, I think. The least durable fighter, I'm going to give to the Ether Wing, just based on the numbers. He has the lowest value of number of attacks to kill on average, because he's a 6-wound model with only 2 toughness. And toughness isn't that important, but it does move the needle just a little bit, and if you only have 6 wounds, it moves it just a little bit down. But I think important to note for this fighter is that average of 4.09 attacks to kill, most things in this game have less than 4 attacks per activation. So the fact that this thing is going to take up at least 1 activation to kill on most enemies is going to be pretty important. He'll probably survive a full round. So he might play out on the tabletop very similar to something that has more durability, just because if he takes 2 activations to kill and a slightly more durable chaff takes 2 activations to kill, one was overkilled and one was killed just enough. So this guy has a probability of inducing an overkill type situation. All right, most durable non-leader. So given this is an even tie between the Iron Golem's Ogre Breacher and the Night Haunt Spirit Host. Both of these are pretty cool models. I think the Spirit Host is really its prime feature is its durability. So these have 30 wounds each with toughness 5, and that's just insane. There's kind of not a close second. I think the Ironjaws have some pretty durable non-leader options, but for these guys' warbands and compared to their peers, these are both notable features within their warband, the amount of durability that these have. So because it's toughness 5, it's actually going to take an average of over 30, so over the base number of wounds. That's just the way the math works out. Average number of attacks to kill these guys. The most durable leader option, and that goes to the good old Ironjaws. I was a little bit surprised with this. Like, Ironjaws was the first faction I looked at in any detail, so it seemed perfectly reasonable and normal to me at the time. But now that I've looked through a lot of the data, this is completely not normal. 35 wounds with toughness 5 makes it just an absolute tank. Just 35 average attacks to kill. That's just it's gonna take a lot of concentrated focus fire, and that's important because this is also a heavy damage dealing unit. So the fact that he can just willy-nilly wander into combat and manage to take quite a lot of damage before getting dispatched means he's going to have plenty of opportunity to dish out his punishment. Very orky. Okay, the best value for effective damage. So effective damage being based on the toughness values that we see in the game, how the strength of this attack profile matches up, and so you can have something that looks like it's a high damage output, but if it was only strength 2, then those numbers are going to come down a little bit. So once everything's factored in and calculated for what is doing the most damage for the points, and that goes to the Splintered Fang Serpents. So this is a 65 point. It's on the upper end of the chaff spectrum, but it is doing 4.41 average damage. So that's on the upper end of the Lion Infantry amount of damage. So this guy's almost semi-elite level of damage, and he's chaff. So really nice, because it's strength 3, even though it's only toughness 2, the strength 3 attack with the damage profile that this thing carries and the number of attacks is a really nice buy. The only drawback to this one, it is also, I think, move 6, but it's not very durable. So it's a little bit more durable than like the Ether Wing, but it's going to be fairly easy to kill at toughness 2 and I believe 8 wounds. So, but just an amazing buy for the damage. The worst attack profile in the game, it goes to the Splintered Fang Serpent Collar, and I double and triple checked to make sure that this was actually a thing, because it looks like such a cool model, and it seems like one of the big advantages of this model is that it had this 8-inch ranged attack, but the attack is 1 attack, strength 3, 1 damage base, 3 damage critical. That works out to an average effective damage of 0.72 per activation. So yes, you can activate this fighter to attack somebody from 8 inches away, but you're going to do basically nothing to them. You are tickling them at range. So really confusing choice of this profile. I'm not really sure, but it is a cool looking model. Hardesthitting Non Leader. So just not factoring in points, just who dishes out the most damage. And it's my favorite. It's the Orcs. It's an even split between the Brute with Gore Choppa, who's a expensive guy, and the Bone Splitter's Savage Big Stabbo. I mean, they're carrying the biggest weapon in the game. It takes 2 of them to do it. I hope they're dishing out some punishment. So 3 attacks, strength 5. It all comes down to an average of 7.23 effective damage per activation. So really nice damage output. That puts them in the upper tier if they were a boss amount of damage. So a lot of bosses don't do this amount of damage. So very nice. The worst non-ranged attack profile. So a lot of ranged attack profiles end up doing very weak damage. So I'm just not factoring those in because they're no sense comparing the two. You're going to use them for different reasons, but for a close melee attack profile, the Iron Golems, basically anything with a shield. The Splinter Fang, Clear Blood guy with the shield, and the Iron Legionary with the shield, they do really terrible amount of damage, 1.43 effective damage. But not really knocking them, because dishing out damage really isn't their job. Just be aware of that. It looks like they're not too bad, but you really have to, I think the primary stat to look at for damage output is the number of attacks. So you see 2 attacks, unless it's like the only outlier there being the Ogre Breacher that does 2 attacks, but his damage and criticals are just off the charts. So 2 attacks with this very pedestrian 1 in 3 damage output is just nothing. The hardest hitting ranged profile, I don't think, if you've been keeping your ear to the ground on the forums and the people complaining online, this shouldn't be too much of a surprise. It's going to be the Stormcast Eternals with the Hurricane Crossbow. So the leader with the Hurricane Crossbow. I don't know if I actually had the leader picture there. I've been trying to look around, and I couldn't figure out which distinguished the Raptor Prime from the regular Raptor. So I apologize if what I have pictured is not a Raptor Prime. It was not made clear. I don't own that kit. I'm not going to buy the kit just to know which picture to put in there. And frankly, I don't really care that much. So apologize. 15-inch range, which is awesome. Like, these are small boards with 30 inches by 40 inches. And this guy has a 30-inch bubble around him of things that he can just smash. It comes out to 5.09 effective damage per activation. So that's elite damage from 15 inches away. It's nuts. The 3 options in the Stormcast is you have the 20-inch version guys with the long strike, whatever it's called. You have these Hurricane guys that have a very strong elite level damage ranged combat and a kind of mediocre melee. And you have the Hunters that have the elite melee and kind of a mediocre ranged. The long shot guys have mediocre damage, both ranged and melee, but they have that little bit extra range. But this, doing 5.09 effective damage from 15 inches away is a problem, basically. I think somebody with a lot of these guys, or with a warband kind of featuring this, is going to cause a lot of havoc. Hardest hitting leader. This is not taking points into account, just who does the most damage. And it turns out it's an even split between the Cypher Lord's Thrallmaster and the Unmade Blissful One. Now, I haven't done deep dives on these factions yet, but just from my feel of them from the data, it seems to be that the leaders in these warbands are really the focus. So these are warbands that have some just kind of basic supporting units, nothing too spectacular, nothing that dishes out a ton of damage, but the leaders here really, really turn up the pain. But I think in both cases, the leaders are a little bit vulnerable, so it's going to be, these are tricky leaders to play, and that they can die fairly quickly, and they're both a little bit pricey. So 8.49 effective average damage, that means, that's just a huge number. You're at least a full point of damage above most other bosses in the game in terms of what they're outputting. The best chaff, this is a really tough one to decide, and I think it kind of comes into how your chaff is used, but there shouldn't be too many surprises here. So I've split it 3 ways based on different factors. So the Aetherwing, I would probably give an overall number 1 to, just because he's 45 points and he can move 12 inches. Oh, and he flies. And like I said, he ends up being a very good value points per wound and actually points per average damage, because that his damage output isn't bad. It's, 1.5 something average. And because he's strength 2, I believe Games Workshop has undervalued him based on what he had. So a strength 2 versus a strength 3 attack actually doesn't move the needle much at all in terms of average damage output. So I think he's been undervalued based on that. So very nice buy. And the fact that he has 4.09 average attacks to kill means he's probably going to last 2 activations of combat. So even though there's more durable options for chaff out there. I mean, well, obviously not for this warband, but there is more durable chaff out there. Most of the other chaff is still going to take 2 activations of combat to kill. So I don't think he's going to play out too weak on the table. And it's just, you can flood him. 45 points, you can just get these things swarming all over the table, capturing objectives, and just making the enemy have to focus on them instead of having to focus on those big elite damage-dealing Stormcast Eternals that are shooting hurricane crossbows and knocking things off the table every single turn. Okay. I put Gloomspite Gitz in here. Maybe he should have been the weakest of these 3 options. Because he's 45 points, he's a good value for his wounds and for his attacks, and I just like his ability. I think it's super annoying, that ability, and that's what chaff. I think he's a good piece of chaff for that ability and for what he does. You can bring a few of these. You're not going to hurt yourself in your list. It's a great chaff. Not many factions have access to chaff of that quality. The one faction that certainly does, though, is the Splintered Fang. I already mentioned the Serpents because they have the best points per average damage in the game, and at 65 points only, they're still in the chaff category, in my opinion, but they're dishing out way more than chaff levels of damage. So you could bring several of these Serpents with you, even though you might need to buy a lot of different kits or whatever. I think you could probably green stuff mold little snakes together. Anyway, with a model doing 4.41 damage per activation, that has to be dealt with. That cannot be ignored. You can't just run away from that. These things do 6 movements, so they can catch up to a lot of things. They can catch up to them and dispatch them. So if you had a little, a little clique of these guys moving around the table, they're not very many points, and they're able to probably pick off elite units very, very quickly. So this is a great piece of chaff. These 3 options, if I had to rank them, probably Ether Wing number 1, Serpent Fang number 2, and then Gloomspite Guy number 3. Gloomspite's a bit more ordinary in comparison to the other 2 kind of remarkable options. The Ether Wing, I should also mention, is surprisingly cheap because everything else in the game seems to indicate that Games Workshop heavily valued the move characteristic. And here you have move 12, and it's just ridiculously cheap. Okay. The worst fighter? I might draw ire for this one. I haven't done this faction yet, deep dive, but it seems to be, from the data, maybe this looks a little bit bad, maybe even split between the 2, or maybe the Life Taker, but this Daughters of Cain, I don't know how to pronounce this, Kinnerai Heartrender, does come out to be the worst looking thing in the spreadsheet. So it's the worst points per wound model in the game by a healthy margin at 17.5. I think this is, what is this model? This model has... It's 175 points, and it has like 10 wounds. I'm just remembering that off the top of my head. Sorry if I'm wrong about that, but it's just ridiculously bad. The points... So if you factor in its toughness, which is not very... I don't think it's very tough. Maybe it is. But it's also the worst in points per attack to kill at 19.53 by a healthy margin. And so I think what's remarkable about this is that it is a 12-inch move fighter with an 8-inch range weapon. That's really cool. Unfortunately, that weapon does almost no damage. It does chaff amount of damage. And so that weapon profile ends up being the worst damage, worst points per average damage profile in the game at 89.19 points per average damage. So, but you do have to keep in mind that is at 8-inch range. So, I could see an argument made for that being better than I'm giving it credit for, but it's a 10 wound model for 175 points. A little bit more obviously bad, but it's not the worst in the spreadsheet. It would be the Life Taker. So that only has the 1-inch range. It is 10 points cheaper at 165, and it does do a little bit more damage, but it's still terrible when you compare it to like the Ether Wing. The Ether Wing is also a 12-inch move with a 1-inch range weapon. The Etherwing does roughly half the amount of damage as the Life Taker, and he's roughly half the durability. But both of them are probably going, if they take 2 rounds of combat, are probably going to be dispatched in 2 rounds of combat. And the Life Taker doesn't do... He does line infantry, like on the lower end of line infantry amount of damage, as opposed to semi-elite or elite amount of points that he is. So think of it this way: the Life Taker is roughly twice as durable and twice as hard hitting as the Etherwing, but he's 3.5 times the points. Okay. Best value line infantry. I consider line infantry to be roughly in the range of 80 points to 130. Anything in that range is, I would consider line infantry. Okay. So I'm giving it to 2 because I think they work out pretty good for 2 different reasons. The Ard Boy with the big choppa, 110 points, so he's a more expensive on the scale, but he has a really good amount of durability, and he does decent amount of damage. Pretty average amount of line infantry damage, but he's a very good buy for durability. Whereas the Iron Golem Armator, he has very good price per damage. His durability is it's still a good buy for the points, but it's not quite as good of a buy as the Ard Boy guy. But his damage for the points is a really good buy. So not too surprising there. I've praised both of these units in the videos in the past. So. Yep. Best value semi-elite, I would put this in the roughly, I guess the 130 to 170 range-ish on points. I'm giving this one to the Stormcast Eternals Gryph-hound. This is the thing. It's roughly like half dog, half lion, half chicken. So the chicken lion dog thing is 150 points. He does nice 5.45 damage. He's movement 6, and he's pretty durable, 17.92. So this is just an overall well-rounded, excellent unit that moves quickly and can take damage and dish it out. There's just no drawbacks to this unit. You can bring plenty of them, and you'll be fine. But the only problem with this unit is that it's in an army with amazing other choices. So it might be the weakest aspect of the Stormcast Eternals warband, and that's unfortunate because this is an excellent semi-elite troop choice. So bring it if you want it. If you like chicken dogs, bring it. You're not going to be hurting. You're going to overpower a lot of things in this game, but you might lose games to other Stormcast Eternals player that don't bring this. So just be aware. The best value elite in the game, so I would put this in basically anything 175 and up that's not a boss. I'm giving this to the big stabbas, and that's not just because I like orcs. From a points perspective, they do a great job. So 175 points, they're one of the most durable units in the game. Very close. They're not tied with the top, but they're right under it because they're toughness 4 with 30 wounds. So they're going to take a lot of punishment to take them down. And while you're trying to take them down, they're dishing out 7.23 damage per activation. And this is all. And the point value here is on the low end of the elite category. So this is they're just an amazing buy. I think every Bone Splitters warband should take this troop and probably really consider two of them, if not 3. Just really good. But the only problem is that they do have a one of the maybe the biggest base in the game. They notably large base, so there's potentially a lot of enemies are going to be able to surround them, so that durability might be something that will get tested. Okay, the best value leader, so best value for the points. Giving this the kind of I'm not an even split, but I really couldn't choose between these because they all kind of seemed good for different reasons. So the More Boy boss, he's the slowest of the three, but for his points, he dishes out a lot of damage, and he's the most durable by a good margin. So you have a good mix of damage output and durability. The only drawback being the move 4 to him. It's a really solid troop choice, and the More Boy boss. And then the other two being the Thrallmaster and the Blissful One. As I mentioned before, these seem to be the centerpiece type units in their warband, so the rest of the warband is just kind of there to support this amazing leader. And both of these guys dish out 8.45 effective damage per activation, and they have different move values. So the unmade Blissful One, which is the guy with the hooks for hands and I don't know, like the peg leg things, the Oscar Pistorius legs, he's doing move 8, so that's great. You can move 8. You can fly around the field, not actually fly, but you can zip around the field and do 8.49 damage per activation. That's really problematic for your enemy. That you're able to get around that quickly and hit that hard. The durability is about the same on them, so you are paying. I'm sorry. So the reason you're paying 15 points more for the Blissful One is just that movement. So everything else is the same: durability, damage output. I'm not talking about abilities yet, just from the stats. So with those two options, they are clear winners in the value for what you get for that leader. I will say with the Savage Orc Morboy boss, he's also a great value, but one advantage of the Savage Orc is that if your leader dies, your warband is not really. Like, the warband doesn't depend on the leader in the same way that the Unmade and the Cypher Lords depend on their leader. There's plenty of other heavy damage dealers and heavy durability options and all kinds of stuff in the Savage Orcs. So for being as good of a leader as he is in a warband that doesn't rely solely on that leader is very notable for the Morboy boss. So that's all I have for you today. I'll be back with a deep dive video on the Unmade shortly. Probably start producing that tonight and hopefully get it out to you shortly. So let's apologize for the delay this week. I was on a business trip, but I'm back, and I'll be producing videos as quick as I can. Thanks.